In this video, we will discuss impactful messaging.
The professor was frustrated that his students ignored his survey request. So he sent out an email asking for help on how to save a RTF file. He had an overwhelming response. Everyone wanted to help him. He then sent out the survey request again. And guess what happened? Everyone responded. They had been primed by the professor. So if you want to make a connection, ask for some help, especially in an area of Tossi's expertise. I'm sure you have experienced when you get to the supermarket checkout counter, the cashier would say, "Would you like to donate $1 to our charity?" And most people say, "Sorry, not today." What happens if we were to refine the message and ask, "Can we round up your bill to the next dollar to help our charity?" Sure, happy to contribute is the kind of response everybody gives. Ladies and gentlemen, the difference? A whopping 21% increase in revenue, simply by refining our message. During a robbery in Gansu, China, the bank robbers shouted to everyone in the bank, "Don't move. This money belongs to the state. Your life belongs to you." Guess what? Everyone in the bank laid down quietly. This is creative messaging. Let's talk about subliminal messaging. It's almost like a spiritual energy. Our interactions with all species, even with plants, occur at two levels, the physical level and our energies. Therefore, it is imperative that we commit to purity of thought and action. You can't fake this. In the next video, we will show you that you are not thinking independently. The speaker's brain waves are indeed transmitted into the listener's brain.
Now we have to ask how these neural patterns in my brain that are associated with my memories and ideas are transmitted into your brains. And we think that there are two factors that enable us to communicate. First, your brains now is physically coupled to the sound wave that I'm transmitting to your brains. And second, we developed a common neural protocol that enables us to communicate. So how do we know that? In my lab in Princeton, we bring people to the fMRI scanner and we scan the brains while they're either telling or listening to real-life stories. And to give you a sense of the stimulus we are using, let me play you now 20 seconds from a story that we used. Okay, so now let's look into your brain and see what's happening when you listen to these kind of stories. So over here you can see 5 listeners. And we start to scan their brains before the story is starting, when they simply lie in the dark and waiting for the story to begin. And as you can see, the brain area is going up and down in each one of them, but the responses are very different and not in sync. However, immediately as the story is starting, something amazing is happening.
So I'm banging out my story and I know it's good. And then I start to make it.
Suddenly you can see that the responses in all of the subjects going locked to the story, and now they are going up and down in a very similar way across all listeners. And in fact, this is exactly what's happening now in your brains when you listen to my sound speaking. And we call this effect neural entrainment. So to test it, we did the following experiments.
It says, "Dear Jim, good story, nice details."
And now you can see that the responses in all the language areas that process the incoming language become aligned or similar across all listeners. However, only when you use the full, engaging, coherent story, the responses spread deeper into the brain, into higher order areas. And we believe that these responses in higher order areas or become similar across listeners because of the meaning conveyed by the speaker, and not by words or sound. So far I only talked about happening in the listener's brain, in your brain, when you're listening to talks. But what's happening in the speaker's brain, in my brain, when I'm speaking to you? We asked the speaker to go into the scanner, we scan his brains, and then compare his. And to our surprise, we saw that all these complex patterns within the listeners actually came from the speaker brain. And we also found the stronger the similarity between the listener's brain and the speaker brain, the better the communication. So I know your brain responses is very different than mine, but I also know that if you really understand me now, then your brain and your brain and your brain are really similar to mine. And this alignment depends not on our ability to understand the basic concept. It also depends on our ability to develop common ground and understanding and shared belief systems. Because we know that in many cases, people understand the exact same story in very different ways. So to test it in the lab, we did the following experiment. We took a story in which a husband lost track of his wife in the middle of the party, and he's calling his best friend asking, "Did you see my wife?" For half of the subject, we were telling that the wife had an affair with the best friend. For the other half, we were telling that the wife is loyal and the husband is very jealous. This one sentence before the story started was enough to make the brain responses of all the people that believe that the wife has an affair to be very similar in these other areas and different than the other group. And if one sentence is enough to make your brain similar to people that think like you and very different than people that think differently than you, think how this effect is going to be amplified in real life when we're all listening to the exact same news item after being exposed for days after days after days to different media channels that give us very different perspectives. So let me summarize. If everything worked as planned tonight, I use my ability to vocalize sounds to be coupled to your brains. And I use this coupling to transmit my brain patterns associated with my memories and ideas into your brains.
Do you recall the last time you yawned? Imagine you're at an office meeting and you yawn. What happens? Several others would also yawn along with you or immediately afterwards, right? Any idea what is going on? Well, science has found that it has to do with something called mirror neurons.
To show this, we took two men, Mr. Nice and Mr. Nasty, and placed them in a controlled environment. Then we asked several volunteers to meet them and discuss different subjects.
Favourite films?
Yeah, well, got plenty of those.
You go first.
What the volunteers didn't know was that while Mr. Nice was being friendly and warm, Mr. Nasty was being as negative and as difficult as possible.
Not really.
But crucially, both Mr. Nice and Mr. Nasty have been asked to deliberately move their bodies in specific ways.
So you got any more favourites?
While cameras watched for a response in the volunteers that would reveal what was going on in their mind. Gradually, as the conversations developed, an extraordinary thing began to happen.
I didn't.
The volunteers with Mr. Nice gradually began to copy him.
They kind of used those well, and the acting was so good, they kind of all got away with it. And the other ones, Last of the Mohicans.
No, I didn't see
I mean, I shouldn't, there's no reason to suggest that we should like that, but there's some...
Meanwhile, those with Mr. Nasty didn't copy him at all.
Well, I'm really enjoying 24 at the moment. Have you seen that?
Saw it once. Yeah, no, I didn't like it very much.
No?
No.
And I think it's the sort of thing I like going to the cinema with myself.
Because the volunteers like Mr. Nice,
I mean, some people say they like to, share this.
their mind prompted them to mimic him.
No, I often go by myself.
A subconscious attempt to strengthen the bond between them.
Well, actually, everyone says it's fantastic.
There are so many great people that you can
Fantastic.
If we establish likability, our minds would mimic each other. Let's move to another area of telepathy or ESP. Here is a verified story that is mind-boggling.
There are certain unexplained phenomena that occur between twins that even modern science simply can't explain. Take the curious case of 7-year-old identical twins Kaylee and Allie from Pennsylvania. They were born just seconds apart and are inseparable, like so many identical twins. The sisters were at a playground. Kaylee was on the trampoline and got hit in the face, suffering a painful black eye.
Her heel hit right here in the eye.
Allie was playing in another area, totally uninjured, But inexplicably, her eye started showing signs of bruising in the exact same place.
My goodness.
Their mother rushed the twins to a nurse who noticed it too. When she got home, she thought it was so strange, she picked up a camera to record it.
Did you get hit by anything? No. Does it hurt? No.
Did one sister telepathically transfer her injury to her twin? Or was it just a coincidence?
Well, does anyone have an explanation? I don't. So let's recap. The work at Princeton University demonstrated the power of neural entrainments. We even looked at mirror neurons, how they interact. But what surprised most people is the power of telepathic connections. Sure, with twins, there might be a 100% connection. But what about us lay folk? Let's say there's a 20% connection. That means your counterparty has the ability to read your mind. What is abundantly clear is that our interactions are much more than just physical. Again, I repeat, don't go into a negotiation with bad vibes. Animosity, vengeance, hatred, etc. could get you into trouble. Compassion with purity of thoughts will get you over the finish line.